taught the medical students about birth and death because it's important, because we all live and we all die. Recently I've been talking to one of my dearest friends from medical school, who's a consultant here in Cambridge, and she's a consultant in care of the elderly, and I was sort of talking to her about the similarities between birth and death. Because they need to be accepted as part of life. They both involve transformation, surrender, and something new. And you can try to make a plan so people know your preferences in both places in time. Dignity, respect, and autonomy are preferable. You have to live before you die, so you can't be paralysed with fear during the process. And both can be physical, emotional, and spiritual events. And does the healthcare system cater for this? And in terms of translating research into clinical practice, there is this tendency to develop protocols. But this year there was a very famous case of a failure of a protocol, which I don't know whether you've heard about it, called the Liverpool Pathway. It was splashed all over the pages of the newspapers in July, because they basically said that there was a deficit of care and we needed more care, less pathway. And in death, there is far more talk about the fact that care should include meeting the social, psychological and spiritual needs of individuals and families. And that's why I thought we should have more of that about birth. And you shouldn't be afraid to contextualise care in those terms. Of course, not a prescriptive pathway, but if it's there in palliative care, why can't it be there at the beginning of life?
I mean, what's extraordinary really is that we've taken the spirituality out of childbirth. I mean, that's extraordinary that we've done that. You know, like in every culture, that the child comes out from the spirit world out into the physical world. I mean, it's a spiritual transition, and how we've managed to take that out is really
when we
mind-blowing.
Climbing the code, some culture, and I believe that truly do say that it's not just a baby, there's some life force that's going through to the baby.
Yeah.
And that cutting that too early means that baby isn't complete, not just physically. But the problem is we live in a culture that likes to measure everything. So how do you measure? We already try to measure dilation. How do you measure spirituality? How do you do a protocol for spirituality?
Well, it's not a protocol, is it? It's just the acknowledgement, like they acknowledge in death that there are, the physical, emotional side. So there's just a respect for that. You'll never be able to protocolise it, but you can say at least that those values should be respected and supported if it's possible.
The author of Birth Talk is actually writing a book on birth as a spiritual experience. And if you read the books of Anna Megaskin, you find a lot of inspiration on the spiritual aspects of childbirth. And there is a literature out there. Some of it is even medieval. The historians have dug very amazing literature on women's spiritual experiences from the medieval to the early modern period. And they do write about it, but we don't talk to historians normally, but maybe another time.
It's quite a book, yes. It's quite mainstream lexicon in the doula community. We talk about birth being a sacred event and about holding that space in a spiritual way and honouring that woman's transition. It's a spiritual transition, not just a physical and emotional. So it's very normal for us to think and speak in that way.
Do you actually withdraw to allow?
That would depend on how appropriate it is for that woman in that birth. As Sarah was saying earlier, every woman has different psychosocial, emotional and spiritual needs during her labour, and a doula who is sensitive to that will come and go and dance with that woman in that space or out of that space as appropriate for that labour and where she's at and what she needs.
Isn't that part of what pregnancy yoga is all about, which is the kind of holding of that space during the pregnancy, so that it's not just a series of postures and some breathing exercises, but you don't necessarily have to spell it out as a spiritual practice, and for many it's not, but it's implicit.
That sounds beautiful to me, and lots of the women I've supported over the years have talked to me about those moments they have at the quiet space in their yoga class when there's a communication with their baby, and when the whole thing becomes a lot more than just her being a vessel for the birth of this baby, but that there's something spiritual happening.
When I think about that, it also reminds me that beyond the healthcare system, beyond the maternity care system, it's a culture as a whole that doesn't recognize this transformation, doesn't recognize that when a baby is born, a mother is born, and a father is born, and especially doesn't recognize the need for the mother to have a special cocoon space after the birth, and expect mother to go back to normal within a few hours or days after the birth.
If not moments.
And doesn't value motherhood, doesn't recognize the importance, when women choose to become full-time mothers, they say, I'm just a mom.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I feel somehow if this is what needs to change in our culture, because then when people recognize that, then they will also recognize how important it is for that transition to happen.
See, I'm sitting between Maggie and also Judy, so I'm actually the midwife on the sort of like the cold face really. I actually do agree with lots of things that go on, and I certainly agree with giving women time and space, but what we actually have to work with as a midwife is a lot of timelines. We not only have to work with other midwives, we have to work with registrars, consultants, all taken into consideration, the amount of women that are coming through, have we bed spaces. It's not as easy and holistic as we would all like it to be. So I think what Birthlight is trying to do is actually put in practices that can be achievable and ongoing, because I think that's really important, that we can actually teach the women knowledge that they can actually take into their birth space, and for it to be accepted. I think that's the word, to be accepted within maternity units, and they can be birthing within major consultant units or really small birthing units, and that makes a big difference as well. So it's actually trying to put into practice all these things, all these good things that we're doing antenatally as well. But I think I've actually been very optimistic, and I've had a positive attitude today. At the end of my talk, I was talking about always these government initiatives have to have something like childbirth initiatives, or and it was, what was it, 1001?
That's new. That's
I
from
loved
September
it.
the 10th.
I loved it. 1001. It's like, oh, and I quite like that. It's a bit catchy as well. So if we could actually get all this within the midwifery curriculum, then we're actually going a big step that way as well, and that would make a really big difference to the women. And then maybe we can actually add all those other lovely bits as well. Because it's actually putting it all into practice, and I just don't see it happening right now. And I'm changing a lot. I change a lot, with my practice over the years. And certainly what I do now is completely different to what I did when I was just newly qualified. But I'm feeling quite positive.